The twin sons of Velzorath cast their dying light across Queen Azora's empire, painting the metallic spires of her palace in shades of blood and gold. From her throne room's highest tower, she gazed out at the vast expanse of conquered worlds, each one a testament to her absolute power. The crimson exosilk armor she wore bore the etched bones of fallen enemies, a grim reminder of what befell those who dared oppose her. The throne room fell silent as her advisors shuffled nervously in their ornate suits, none brave enough to speak first. Finally, one stepped forward, his hands trembling as he activated a holoprojector. The image that materialized made Azora's blood boil. A lone human, covered in grease and grinning like a fool, walked away from the smoking wreckage of the Zenthri Lance, her prized flagship. The ship's fusion core had been sabotaged with surgical precision, taking 3 Dominion-class cruisers and a moon's worth of resources with it when it exploded. "Corin Mace," she hissed, her voice like venom dripping from a blade. This wasn't the first time the human mechanic had humiliated her forces. He wasn't a soldier or a spy, just a fixer of broken things. Yet somehow, he'd broken her most feared weapon and made her look weak in front of the galaxy. Azora crushed the projector in her bare hand, the metal crumpling like paper. She turned toward the great sealed gate behind her throne, its obsidian surface unmarked by time or war. Ancient words spilled from her lips, syllables banned by most civilizations, commands that made the very air tremble. The floor cracked beneath her feet as hidden mechanisms groaned to life. Steam hissed from vents as the massive doors slowly parted, revealing a chamber that hadn't seen light for 3 decades. From the shadows emerged her greatest creation, Verok, the dreadwolf of Sereth. Standing as tall as a building, his black fur rippled with metallic veins that pulsed with barely contained energy. His eyes burned like twin eclipses, and his breath steamed with chemical fury. The Queen's sigil was burned permanently into his skull, marking him as her instrument of death. For 30 years, he had slumbered in chains. His name was still whispered in rebel camps like a curse waiting to be fulfilled. Now, as recognition flickered in his glowing eyes, Azora raised her hand. Neural commands flowed like liquid fire along her arm. "Find the human," she commanded, her voice cutting through the air like a blade. "Rip him apart. Return his skull to my lap." Verok's roar split the sky above the palace, a sound that made priests fall to their knees and seasoned warriors wet themselves in terror. Without hesitation, the beast launched himself into the void, gravity harnesses and jet propulsion fused into his legs carrying him toward the outer rim. Somewhere among the junk moons of the frontier, Corin Mace was humming an old tune while fixing a busted coolant valve. He had no idea that the galaxy's most feared predator was already tracking his scent through the stars. The hunt had begun. The wind on Arak Belt-5 carried the sharp taste of rust and ozone, whipping through the skeletal remains of old mining towers that leaned precariously under their own weight. Once, this place had been a proud interstellar hub. Now it was just another graveyard in the void, buried under perpetual static storms. Corin Mace wiped sweat from his brow as he examined the damaged rear thruster of a cargo hauler. The scorch marks told a story he'd seen too many times. Some hotshot pilot had tried to jury-rig the plasma flow and nearly blown himself to bits. "Every idiot thinks they're a pilot until their ship tries to explode," he muttered, rolling back onto his mat of tools. That's when he noticed the silence. The constant buzz of the static storms had vanished. The crackling energy that filled the air was gone, replaced by an unnatural quiet that made his skin crawl. Even the wind seemed to retreat, as if the very atmosphere was holding its breath. Then he heard it, the deliberate scrape of massive claws against metal. Not the frantic scratching of some scavenger, but the measured steps of something that owned whatever ground it walked on. Corin looked up from his work and felt his heart skip a beat. The creature that emerged from behind the scrap tower stood 3 stories tall, its fur blacker than the void between stars. Metallic veins ran through its coat like living circuitry, humming with barely contained power. Its eyes burned like twin suns behind smoke, and fangs gleamed like forged steel in its massive jaws. The Queen's sigil glowed on its forehead like a brand of ownership. "Ah, Corin said, not bothering to move. You're here for me. Verok growled, a sound so deep it resonated in Corin's chest. The beast's muscles coiled like loaded springs, ready to tear him apart with a single pounce. This was it, the moment he'd probably earned a dozen times over with his sabotage missions. But instead of running or begging, Corin raised both hands peacefully. I know you're supposed to kill me. Rip me apart, bring back something for her to gloat over. He paused, tilting his head as he studied the massive predator. But I think you've got a problem of your own. The dreadwolf hesitated, confusion flickering in its burning eyes. Corin pointed to a section of exposed plating above the beast's right shoulder joint. That's a stress fracture. Heat overload damage, probably from whatever neural shunt she's using to control you. He kept his voice calm, steady. And look, I'm no soldier, but I know pain when I see it. Verok's growl deepened, but something had changed. The mindless hunger in its eyes was replaced by something else, uncertainty, maybe even curiosity. I can fix that, Corin continued, or you can bite me in half and limp home like a malfunctioning drone. Your choice. For a long moment, predator and prey stared at each other. Then, impossibly, the great beast sat down with a heavy thud that shook the ground. Corin let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. Well, that's a first. Moving slowly to avoid startling the massive predator, Corin approached with his tool kit. Verok watched him with those burning eyes, every muscle still coiled and ready to strike. But the beast remained perfectly still as the human began his work. She's been overriding your healing systems, Corin muttered, carefully scanning the stress fracture with his diagnostic tools. Figures. She never wanted you to feel anything but rage. His hands moved with practiced precision, bypassing the damaged control circuits and rerouting power away from the overheated neural node. The work was delicate, one wrong move could trigger the beast's pain response and turn him into paste. You know, Corin said as he worked, I've fixed a lot of broken things in my time. Ships, stations, even people occasionally. But I've never tried to fix someone's pain before. He tightened the last connection and stepped back. The change was immediate, the tension in Verok's massive frame simply melted away. The beast stretched his leg carefully, testing the joint, and for the first time in decades, there was no pain. Verok looked at Corin with new eyes. Not the mindless stare of a weapon, but something deeper. Something that remembered what it felt like to choose. You're welcome, Corin said with a nervous laugh. Now, you going to kill me, or can I get back to my actual job? The answer came in the form of silence. Then, incredibly, Verok lowered himself to the ground and nudged Corin gently with his massive snout. I'm not riding you, Corin protested. The beast grunted and nudged him again, more insistently this time. Fine, Corin muttered, slinging his tool pack over his shoulder. But you better not drop me. As they rose into the sky together, leaving the rust-covered towers of Arak Belt-5 behind, something fundamental had changed. The Queen's neural command still burned in Verok's skull, but they were no longer the only voice he heard. For the first time in his existence, the wolf had a choice. And he chose not to return to his master. Miles away in the void, Queen Azora stood at her observation deck, waiting for confirmation that the human was dead. The silence stretched on, and with each passing hour, her rage grew colder and more dangerous. She had created the perfect weapon, and somehow, a simple mechanic had turned it against her. But Azora hadn't conquered half the galaxy by accepting defeat. If Verok would not serve, then she would make the entire galaxy her hunting ground. The hunt was far from over, it was just beginning. The central spires of Velzarath rose like sharpened daggers from the heart of Queen Azora's empire. Within the highest tower, she stood motionless, her patience wearing thinner with each passing hour. No triumphant roar had echoed across the stars. No fragment of bone had been delivered to her throne. General Vaughn materialized in a flash of light, his face pale with barely controlled fear. In 30 years of service, he had never seen his queen so dangerously still. Why haven't I received confirmation? Azora demanded, her voice sharp enough to cut steel. Vaughn swallowed hard. My queen, there was interference. The dreadwolf was spotted in orbit around Arak Belt-5, but most of our surveillance footage was corrupted. He hesitated. One image survived. You may want to show me. The hologram that flickered to life was blurry and distorted, but unmistakable. Verok, her perfect weapon, walked calmly through a storm with a man riding on his back. Not dragged as prey, not carried as a trophy, riding as a companion. The silence that followed was more terrifying than any scream. Finally, Azora turned to face her general, and the cold calculation in her eyes made his blood freeze. How many enemies has this mechanic made? Plenty, my queen. Half the systems under our control have posted bounties. Independent syndicates, rogue war masters, even the arch-priests want him dead. A razor-sharp smile spread across Azora's face. Then let's give them all an invitation. Within hours, every criminal network, mercenary guild, and rival faction in known space received the same message. Corin Mace's bounty had been increased to a sum that could buy entire star systems. The price was so astronomical that even corpses would crawl from their graves to collect it. But the Queen's revenge wouldn't stop there. And the wolf, she continued, gazing out at the infinite darkness beyond her throne room. If Verok no longer remembers his master, then let the galaxy teach him fear again. The hunt had evolved. What began as a simple execution had become a war that would span the stars. Every assassin, every bounty hunter, every desperate fool with a ship and a weapon would be tracking Corin Mace and his unlikely companion. Far from the palace, on a forgotten world at the edge of civilized space, Corin sat by a small fire while Verok rested nearby. The massive wolf's breathing was steady and peaceful, perhaps the first real rest he'd had in decades. Corin's communication device chirped with incoming messages. Bounty alerts, threat assessments, warnings from old contacts. The numbers kept climbing until they reached amounts that made his head spin. Well, big guy, he said, looking over at his sleeping companion, looks like we've really stepped in it this time. Verok opened one glowing eye and huffed softly, as if to say he'd faced worse odds before. Yeah, but have you ever faced them with a choice? Corin asked quietly. The wolf's eye closed again, but Corin could swear he saw the ghost of a smile in that massive face. For the first time in either of their lives, they would face whatever came next on their own terms. The galaxy was coming for them, but they wouldn't be easy prey. Greyglass was a planet that never knew peace. Perpetual storms raged across its surface, and the air was thick with crystal dust that could slice through unprotected skin. The sky never revealed stars, hidden behind endless clouds of debris. It was the perfect place for those who wanted to disappear. But nowhere in the galaxy was far enough to escape Queen Azora's wrath. They came in waves, first the desperate scavengers drawn by the impossible bounty, then the professional killers, and finally the war fleets of rival empires who saw an opportunity to claim both the prize and the legendary dreadwolf. Each attack was more coordinated than the last, but each met the same fate. Corin had learned to read the signs in Verok's posture. The way his ears would twitch at the sound of approaching ships. How his muscles would coil before unleashing devastating attacks that sent enemy vessels tumbling through space in flames. The human mechanic had become something he never expected, a strategist, coordinating their defenses while his unlikely partner dealt with threats that could level cities. But the real change was in Verok himself. No longer the mindless weapon of destruction, he fought with purpose and restraint. He could have torn their attackers apart in moments, but instead he disabled ships and scattered fleets, giving crews a chance to flee rather than face certain death. "You're going soft," Corin joked after watching the wolf carefully avoid destroying an escape pod filled with young pirates who'd clearly been in over their heads. Verok snorted and nudged him with his massive snout, a gesture that had become their version of an eye roll. The turning point came when Admiral Krell himself arrived with a full battle fleet. The same man who had served Queen Azora faithfully for decades, commanding enough firepower to glass a planet. His flagship broadcast a message across all frequencies. Surrender the human and the beast, and you will be granted quick deaths. Resist, and we will make your suffering legendary. Corin looked up at his companion, who was already rising to his feet with a familiar growl building in his throat. What do you say, partner? Ready to show them what freedom looks like? The battle that followed would be talked about in cantinas and command centers for generations. Verok moved through the enemy fleet like a force of nature, but not as the mindless destroyer Azora had created. He was precise, efficient, protecting his human friend while dismantling the Admiral's carefully planned assault. When the smoke cleared, Admiral Krell's flagship drifted powerless in space, its crew evacuated to lifeboats. The rest of the fleet had scattered to the winds, carrying with them a message that would spread across the galaxy: the Queen's ultimate weapon had chosen a new master. But in her tower on Velzorath, Queen Azora was far from finished. She stood before a new gate, one that hadn't been opened in a century. Behind it lay horrors that made Verok look like a household pet. If one dreadwolf could turn against her, she would create a dozen more. 100. However many it took to drag Corin Mace back to face her justice. Yet even as she prepared to unleash fresh nightmares upon the galaxy, something had already changed. Word was spreading through rebel networks and underground channels. If a simple mechanic could turn the Queen's greatest weapon against her, if freedom was possible even for the most thoroughly enslaved, then perhaps the Empire wasn't as unbreakable as it seemed. On distant worlds, in hidden bases and forgotten colonies, beings who had lived in fear for decades began to whisper a dangerous word: hope. Far from the palace, on a small moon where binary suns painted the sky in brilliant colors, Corin worked on repairing Verok's aging cybernetic implants while the great wolf rested peacefully in the warm light. They had become something unprecedented in the galaxy, a partnership built on choice rather than control, friendship rather than fear. You know, Corin said as he carefully adjusted a neural stabilizer, I think we've started something here. Something that crazy queen of yours isn't going to like very much. Verok opened one glowing eye and made a sound that might have been laughter. He had been created to end civilizations, but perhaps his greatest victory would be helping one small human show the galaxy that no chain was truly unbreakable. In the distance, more ships approached on the horizon. More bounty hunters, more imperial forces, more beings drawn by the promise of unimaginable wealth. But this time, Corin wasn't afraid. He had learned something important in his travels with the Great Wolf. Sometimes the best way to fix something isn't to repair what's broken. Sometimes you have to break it down completely and build something better in its place. The Queen could send her armies, her monsters, her fleets. She could offer rewards that would tempt gods. But she could never take back the choice she had inadvertently given her greatest weapon. And in a galaxy ruled by fear and oppression, choice was the most dangerous weapon of all. As the twin suns set on another day of freedom, Corin smiled and got back to work. There would always be something to fix, someone to help, some small act of rebellion to carry out. And now he had a partner who understood that the best victories weren't won through destruction, but through the simple act of choosing to be better than what others expected. The hunt would continue. The Queen would never stop sending her forces. But they had already won something far more valuable than any bounty could buy. They had won the right to choose their own destiny. The end.